She lost her voice, but her scandalous secret will echo through the halls of high society. As a humble maid, her life was meant to be invisible, but one fateful, sinful night in the dark library changed everything. Left pregnant, voiceless, and brutally cast into the winter streets, she hid in the shadows, until Arthur, the ruthless Duke, returned, and his obsession turned into a dark fury. The rotting wood of the attic door splintered with a deafening crack. It tore from its rusted iron hinges, slamming violently against the damp brick wall. A bitter January wind rushed into the suffocating squalor of the London slum, disturbing the thin layer of frost that coated the uneven floorboards. Isla shrank back into the darkest corner of the tiny room. Her breath caught painfully in her throat, her trembling hands instinctively flying to wrap around the heavy, undeniable swell of her pregnant belly. He stood in the shattered doorway, entirely out of place amidst the ruin. Arthur Vance, the Duke of Blackwood. He wore a heavy, dark greatcoat that seemed to absorb the meager light of the single flickering candle resting on the floor. The driving winter rain had soaked his broad shoulders, and his usually immaculate dark hair was windblown, framing a face chiseled from pure, unyielding stone. His broad chest heaved with a ragged, dangerous breath. The air in the freezing room suddenly felt too thin to breathe. For months, Isla had convinced herself that he was a ghost, a phantom memory born from a single, forbidden night of vulnerability in his vast, shadowed library. But the man staring at her now was no ghost. He was a force of nature. His piercing, obsessive gaze was fixed entirely on her. Arthur stepped into the freezing room. His polished leather boots struck the floorboards with the terrifying finality of a predator cornering its prey. He did not look at the peeling wallpaper. He did not look at the threadbare blanket she used to survive the freezing nights, or the single piece of stale bread resting on a wooden crate. His dark, furious eyes scanned the hollows of her pale cheeks, the terror in her wide eyes, and finally the undeniable curve of his child beneath her worn woolen shawl. A muscle feathered in his tight jaw, the silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating, vibrating with an unspoken history that neither had ever dared to name. He had spent 7 months believing she had simply walked away, taking with her the only warmth he had ever known in his rigid, duty-bound life. He had been raised by a cruel father to believe that affection was a weapon, a weakness that would inevitably be used against him. He had guarded his heart behind an impenetrable wall of ice and authority. Yet she had slipped through, and then she was gone. To find her here, destitute, hiding in the shadows of the East End and carrying his blood, it shattered the last remaining remnants of his legendary restraint. He stopped mere inches from her. The scent of rain, leather, and expensive sandalwood washed over her, completely overwhelming her senses. The familiar fragrance brought a sudden, stinging rush of tears to her eyes. Isla pressed her shoulders harder against the brick, her chest rising and falling in rapid, silent panic. She desperately wanted to explain. She wanted to scream that she had not run away, that she had been thrown into the snow like garbage, that the sheer terror of that night had stolen the very voice from her throat. But no sound came. Her lips parted, trembling violently, yet only a shallow, broken breath escaped into the freezing air. Arthur did not wait for an explanation. He reached out, his large, dark-gloved hand wrapping gently, but with absolute, terrifying possession around her upper arm. His touch sent a violent jolt of heat straight to her core, a sharp reminder of the power he wielded over her body and her fate. He was the Duke of Blackwood. He owned estates, ships, and the loyalty of the House of Lords. And now he had found what belonged to him. "You are carrying my heir," he commanded, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that left absolutely no room for negotiation or escape. "You are coming with me." Isla shook her head frantically, a single tear spilling over her dark lashes. She tried to pull away, terrified that she was nothing but a vessel to him now, a scandalous problem to be locked away in one of his sprawling estates until the child was born. If he only wanted the heir, what would happen to her once the baby arrived? She had survived the slums through sheer maternal instinct. She could not surrender her child to a man who might cast her out a second time. But his grip, though careful not to bruise, was unyielding. He did not drag her. Instead, seeing the raw terror in her luminous eyes, the Duke of Blackwood did something that sent a shockwave through her fragile heart. He stripped off his heavy, expensive greatcoat. Without a word of hesitation, he wrapped it securely around her trembling shoulders, sealing her in his overwhelming warmth. The thick wool smelled of him, heavy and protective. Before she could protest, his arm went around her waist, supporting her exhausted frame. He guided her out of the shadows, away from the rotting attic, and down the narrow, dangerous stairs of the tenement building. The velvet interior of the Blackwood carriage felt like an entirely different world. The heavy door snapped shut with a solid thud, instantly sealing out the relentless roar of the London rain and the miserable stench of the slums. The sudden transition was jarring. Isla huddled into the far corner of the plush leather seat, pulling Arthur's oversized coat tighter around her fragile frame. The luxurious fabric still held the heat of his body, wrapping her in a masculine comfort she had not felt in 7 agonizing months. Sitting opposite her, the Duke was a study in dangerous stillness. The dim, flickering glow of the carriage lamps cast sharp, imposing shadows across his aristocratic profile. He was staring at her with an intensity that made her skin burn. He did not demand answers. He did not ask why she had left the country estate or why she was living in such horrific poverty. He simply watched her, assessing her physical state with a dark, calculating fury that she knew was directed at whoever had allowed this to happen, to what belonged to him. Isla lowered her gaze to her lap, her cold fingers nervously twisting the fabric of her ruined linen dress. She was suffocating under the weight of her own silence. If she could speak, she would tell him about the night her world ended. She would tell him about the betrayal that had driven her into the darkness. She would tell him how, mere hours after he had ridden out to tend to a political crisis at his northern estate, the formidable Mrs. Higgins had discovered them. The housekeeper's eyes had held nothing but pure venom as she accused Isla of seducing the Duke to steal his wealth. The memory still made Isla's heart race with sickening panic. She had been dragged from her small servants' quarters in the dead of night, her meager belongings thrown into the courtyard fireplace to burn. The housekeeper's words still echoed in her nightmares. He ordered it himself, Mrs. Higgins had sneered, pushing a terrified Isla out into the brutal December blizzard. He has no use for a common maid now that he has had his fill. If you ever show your face near this family again, I will have you hanged for a thief. The shock of the betrayal, combined with the freezing temperature and the horrifying realization that she was entirely alone in the world, had triggered something dark and unbreakable in Isla's mind. She had collapsed in the snow, screaming for mercy until her throat bled, but no one had come. When she finally woke in the back of a farmer's cart, headed toward the anonymity of the slums of London, her voice was completely, permanently gone. The trauma had locked her words behind an impenetrable wall of pure terror. For months, she had survived on scraps, taken in by Clara, a kind but desperately poor street seamstress. Isla had scrubbed tavern floors in absolute silence, hoarding every penny, fiercely determined to protect the tiny life growing inside her. She had convinced herself that Arthur had never cared. He was a duke, a man raised to believe affection was a weakness. To him, she had been a momentary distraction, a mistake easily discarded and forgotten by his vast household. But as the carriage jolted over the wet cobblestones, heading toward the affluent streets of Mayfair, the man sitting across from her did not look indifferent. Arthur shifted on the leather seat, leaning forward to close the distance between them. The sudden movement made Isla flinch instinctively. She pressed herself deeper into the velvet corner, raising her hands in a silent, desperate plea for distance. She expected anger. She expected him to demand her compliance. Instead, the Duke froze. A flash of profound, undeniable pain crossed his stoic features, quickly masked by his iron control. He slowly withdrew his hands, resting them heavily on his own knees instead, giving her the physical space she so desperately needed. He had noticed the flinch. He had noticed her complete, unnatural silence when he cornered her in the attic. He had not heard her utter a single sound, not even a gasp of protest. And worst of all, he had noticed the absolute terror in her eyes when she looked at him. "I will not hurt you," Arthur said. His voice dropped to a softer, more dangerous register that commanded the quiet space of the carriage. "But I swear to you, Isla, I will spend the rest of my life hunting down whoever did." Isla closed her eyes, a heavy tear slipping down her pale cheek and soaking into the collar of his expensive coat. She was no longer freezing in the slums, but she was trapped in a new kind of cage. She was completely at the mercy of a man who possessed the power to destroy cities, a man who desperately wanted his heir, but whom she feared could never truly want her. The journey ahead was terrifying, because she knew that giving him her child might eventually mean losing the last remaining piece of her shattered heart. The grand iron gates of the Blackwood London townhouse parted with a heavy, metallic groan. Through the rain-streaked glass of the carriage, Isla stared at the towering stone facade of Arthur's world. It was a fortress of aristocratic privilege, a universe away from the crumbling slum she had just left. The sheer scale of the wealth terrified her. It was a physical reminder of the insurmountable wall between a powerful duke and a ruined, voiceless maid. Before the horses had fully halted in the private courtyard, Arthur pushed the carriage door open. He ignored the footman who rushed out with large umbrellas, stepping directly into the freezing downpour to assist her himself. When Isla hesitated, her fingers white-knuckling the edge of his heavy coat, he did not rush her. He simply offered his large, gloved hand, waiting patiently in the rain until she gathered the courage to place her trembling fingers within his grasp. The interior of the townhouse was a blinding display of polished marble, glittering chandeliers, and suffocating silence. A line of perfectly postured servants stood at strict attention in the grand foyer. Their eyes widened imperceptibly at the sight of their formidable master, dripping wet, escorting a disheveled, pregnant woman wrapped in his own coat. Arthur paid them no mind. His voice cut through the grand hall like a whip. "Thomas." An older gentleman with kind eyes and impeccable posture immediately stepped forward from the shadows. "Your Grace." "Send for Dr. Sterling at once," Arthur commanded. His grip on Isla's waist was firm and fiercely protective as he guided her toward the grand staircase. "Have him brought to the East Wing guest chambers. And Thomas, if a single word of this night leaves this house, I will dismiss the entire staff without a character reference." "Is that understood?" "Perfectly, Your Grace," the valet replied softly. He offered a brief, reassuring glance toward Isla before hurrying away. Less than an hour later, the oppressive reality of Arthur's wealth closed in on her entirely. Isla sat rigidly on the edge of a massive, silk-draped bed in a chamber larger than the entire tavern where she used to work. A roaring fire chased the winter chill from her bones, but her heart pounded a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. Dr. Sterling, a severe man with sharp spectacles and a clinical, detached demeanor, stepped toward her with a silver medical instrument. He moved with the brisk arrogance of a man accustomed to being obeyed, viewing her not as a traumatized woman, but as a medical puzzle carrying a nobleman's prized possession. "If you will just recline, young woman, I must assess the viability of His Grace's child," the doctor murmured, reaching out without permission to untie the collar of her borrowed nightdress. Pure panic flooded Isla's veins. The clinical, forceful movement mirrored the cold cruelty of her banishment. She violently scrambled backward across the mattress, her breath escaping in a harsh, soundless gasp. Her hand struck the bedside table, sending a crystal water pitcher crashing to the floor. The glass shattered into 100 glittering pieces, mimicking the sudden chaos in the room. She pulled her knees tightly to her chest, pressing herself into the velvet headboard, her eyes wild and pleading as she shook her head frantically. The heavy oak door swung open. Arthur stepped into the chamber, his dark eyes instantly taking in the shattered glass, the annoyed physician, and the absolute terror radiating from the woman trembling on his bed. The Duke's face darkened with a lethal, quiet fury. "What is happening here?" Dr. Sterling sighed, adjusting his spectacles with a huff of impatience. "She is entirely uncooperative, Your Grace. I cannot confirm the health of the heir if she behaves like a frightened street urchin." Arthur's posture became unnervingly still. He did not shout. Instead, his voice dropped to a terrifyingly quiet whisper that chilled the warm room. "Get out." The doctor blinked, clearly confused. "Your Grace, the examination." "I said, get out of my house," Arthur interrupted. His gaze fixed on the physician with a predatory stillness. "If you ever speak of her in such a manner again, I will personally ruin your practice. Leave." The physician paled rapidly. He snapped his medical bag shut and fled the room without another word. The heavy door clicked shut, plunging the chamber into a heavy, crackling silence, broken only by the snapping fire. Arthur remained by the door for a long moment, watching her. He saw the way she clutched the thick blanket to her chest, the defensive curve of her spine, the sheer desperation of a creature who expected to be punished for her disobedience. He suddenly realized that his overwhelming resources, his renowned doctors, his efficient staff, his grand house, were not providing her safety. They were simply a new, terrifyingly gilded cage. He moved toward the bed, keeping his steps slow and deliberate, telegraphing every movement so he would not startle her. He did not sit beside her on the mattress. Instead, the Duke of Blackwood, a man who commanded the attention of Parliament and terrified the aristocracy, slowly lowered himself to one knee beside the shattered glass. He made himself entirely level with her, completely surrendering his height and physical dominance. "No one will touch you against your will, Isla," he said softly, holding her wide, fearful gaze. "Not in this house, not ever again." Isla's breath hitched in her throat. She studied the harsh lines of his face, searching for a lie or a hidden threat, but found only a fierce, unwavering sincerity. Slowly, the tight coil of panic in her chest began to loosen. She let her head rest against the velvet headboard, her exhausted body finally absorbing the truth that she was safe, at least for tonight. Later that evening, the fragile illusion of gentle safety gave way to the cold reality of their social situation. Arthur had summoned her to his private study. The vast room was heavy with the masculine scent of leather, ink, and expensive tobacco. Thomas had quietly served a tray of warm tea and biscuits, offering Isla a kind, encouraging smile before retreating and closing the heavy mahogany doors. Isla sat in a wingback chair near the hearth, the warm porcelain cup trembling slightly in her hands. She wore a simple, elegant dressing gown that Thomas had procured, though she felt entirely like an imposter wrapped in stolen finery. Across the room, Arthur stood behind his massive desk, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the dark window panes. The protective gentleness he had shown in the bedroom had receded, replaced by the calculating, unyielding aristocrat she remembered. "The society we live in is unforgiving," Arthur began, his voice echoing with authority. "If you remain here simply as my ward or my mistress, the aristocracy will tear you apart. They will invent vicious rumors, they will ruin your name entirely, and they will brand the child you carry as a bastard." Isla lowered her eyes to her tea, a cold, heavy weight settling in her stomach. She knew exactly how cruel the wealthy could be. She had the permanent silence to prove it. She assumed he was going to offer her a hidden cottage in the countryside, a quiet life tucked away where his reputation would remain unblemished. I will not allow my blood to be hidden in the shadows, nor will I allow you to bear the brunt of their cruelty, he continued. He stepped out from behind the desk and closed the distance between them. He stopped in front of her chair, looking down with an expression of absolute, terrifying resolve. I have already sent a rider to the Archbishop. I have secured a special license. We will be married tomorrow morning. Isla's head snapped up. Her eyes went wide with sheer disbelief. A duke marrying a disgraced mute scullery maid was not just a scandal, it was social suicide. It would sever his political alliances and invite the relentless mockery of the entire nation. She frantically set the teacup on a side table and stood, shaking her head. She pointed to herself, then gestured broadly toward the grand room around them, trying to communicate the impossible, ridiculous gap between their stations. She pressed her hand to her throat, reminding him of her brokenness. She was nothing. She had no voice. He could not do this. Arthur reached out, gently catching her frantically gesturing hands in his own. His warm, strong fingers smoothed over her rough, work-worn skin, calloused from months of scrubbing tavern floors to protect his child. I do not care about the ton, Isla, he stated. His voice was a low, fierce rumble that left no room for argument. I care about securing what is mine. You will have my name, my absolute protection, and the unquestioned respect of everyone who crosses our threshold. He released her hands and took a half-step back, intentionally re-establishing the formal distance between them. The fleeting warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced by the grim reality of a business transaction. I need your consent, Arthur demanded quietly. I cannot and will not force you to the altar. Look at me and nod if you understand and agree to my terms. Isla looked up into the dark, imposing depths of his eyes. He was offering her the ultimate protection, ensuring her child would never know a single day of hunger or the biting cold of the winter streets. But the stark, authoritative way he delivered the proposal broke a fragile piece of her heart. He was marrying her out of duty and extreme possessiveness over his bloodline. He desperately wanted the heir, and she was merely the necessary vessel he had to legally acquire to secure it. She swallowed the bitter lump in her throat. She had no other choice, no money, and nowhere else to run. Gathering the last shreds of her shattered pride, Isla lifted her chin, met his commanding gaze, and gave a single stiff nod. Arthur let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. The contract was sealed. He had successfully trapped her under his roof and secured his noble legacy. But as he watched her slowly sink back into the chair, turning her pale face away to stare blankly into the fire, a hollow, aching victory settled heavily in his chest. He had forced her compliance, but the defiant, heartbroken look in her eyes proved that a golden cage was still a cage. He was miles away from possessing the one thing he truly wanted, and for the first time in his life, his immense wealth could not buy it. The private ceremony the following morning was a blur of hurried vows and echoing silence. The grand, vaulted chapel of the Blackwood townhouse felt entirely too large for the 3 people standing before the altar. Thomas had served as the sole witness, offering a comforting smile as the Archbishop rushed through the sacred, ancient liturgy. Isla had worn a simple, elegant gown of pale ivory silk, summoned overnight by the Duke's vast resources, but she felt like a complete imposter draped in stolen finery. When prompted for her vows, she could only lower her head in shame. Arthur had answered for both of them, his deep voice carrying a heavy solemnity that made the stone walls resonate, before he slid a heavy gold band onto her trembling finger. Now, the stifling quiet of the master suite pressed heavily against her. The wedding night had arrived. Isla sat rigidly on the edge of the massive 4-poster bed. She was clad in a delicate cotton nightdress, her damp hair falling in tangled, heavy waves over her shoulders. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows across the expensive damask wallpaper. Her pulse hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew exactly what was expected of a duchess. She understood the brutal, contractual nature of aristocratic marriages, especially one designed solely to legitimize an heir. She braced herself, squeezing her eyes shut, preparing to endure whatever physical duty the Duke demanded to cement his legal claim over her body. The heavy door clicked open. Arthur stepped into the chamber, having discarded his formal coat and cravat. The crisp white linen of his shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the strong, tense lines of his neck. He paused near the threshold, his dark eyes instantly locking onto her small, rigid form perched at the edge of the mattress. He saw the white-knuckled grip she maintained on the silk blankets. He saw the way her shoulders were hiked toward her ears in sheer defensive anticipation. A heavy, aching sorrow flared in his chest, entirely unfamiliar to a man who usually felt nothing but cold resolve. Arthur slowly crossed the room, intentionally keeping his footsteps loud enough so he would not startle her. He stopped a respectful distance from the bed. He did not reach for the delicate ribbons of her nightdress. He did not demand her submission. Instead, his gaze fell upon the silver hairbrush resting on the mahogany vanity table. Arthur picked up the brush, the heavy silver cold against his large palm. He stepped behind her, moving with slow, deliberate caution so she could track his every movement in the large vanity mirror. "You are trembling," Arthur murmured. His voice was a low, steady rumble that vibrated comfortably through the quiet room. "You do not need to fear me, Isla. Not tonight, not ever." He gently gathered the heavy mass of her dark hair in one hand. Isla stiffened instinctively, bracing for pain or impatience, but as the soft bristles of the brush began to glide through her tangled locks, a surprising, melodic wave of comfort washed over her. His strokes were impossibly gentle. His large hands navigated the knots with a patience she had never expected from a man who commanded political empires. The rhythmic, soothing motion slowly began to unravel the tight coil of terror in her chest. Isla opened her eyes, watching his reflection in the mirror. The harsh, ruthless Duke the world feared was gone. In his place was a man whose brow was furrowed in quiet concentration, his touch reverent, as if she were made of fragile glass rather than a hardened survivor of the London slums. "I should have returned sooner," Arthur confessed quietly to the empty room, his gaze fixed on the dark strands slipping through his fingers. "I allowed my obligations in the north to blind me to what was happening under my own roof. When I came back and found your quarters empty—" He stopped brushing for a fraction of a second. The muscle in his jaw tightened. The memory clearly brought a surge of dark, destructive fury that he quickly forced down. "I thought I had lost the only real thing in my life," he finished, his voice dropping to a raw, vulnerable whisper. Isla's breath caught. She stared at his reflection, the absolute sincerity in his dark eyes piercing straight through her remaining defenses. He was not talking about the unborn heir, he was talking about her. For the first time since that terrible night in the snow, she felt the crushing weight of her isolation begin to fracture. She lifted her hand, slowly placing her small, warm fingers over his large hand, resting on her shoulder. Arthur froze at the voluntary contact. He looked down, his thumb gently brushing across her knuckles. He did not push for more. He simply set the brush aside, stepped back, and turned down the heavy gas lamps, leaving the room bathed in soft firelight. He climbed into the opposite side of the vast bed, keeping a wide expanse of mattress between them. He offered her the ultimate luxury she had been denied for months, safety without expectation. 2 days later, the fragile, quiet peace of their new reality was abruptly shattered by the arrival of the outside world. Isla was sitting in the sunlit drawing room, her fingers resting lightly on the keys of a polished grand piano. She had not played a single note, simply enjoying the smooth, cool ivory beneath her hands. Arthur sat in a leather armchair near the tall windows, reviewing a stack of estate ledgers, glancing up every few moments just to ensure she was still there. The heavy double doors swung open without warning. Thomas stepped in, his usually calm expression tight with suppressed disapproval. "Lord Harrington has arrived, Your Grace," the valet announced. "He insisted it was an urgent matter of Parliament." Before Arthur could refuse the intrusion, a tall, elegantly dressed aristocrat strode past the valet into the drawing room. Lord Harrington possessed a sharp, aristocratic face and a smile that never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. He was a known political rival of the Blackwood family, a man who traded in whispers and ruined reputations. "Blackwood," Harrington drawled, his gaze sweeping the room before landing entirely on Isla. A slow, cruel smirk spread across his face as he took in her simple morning dress and the undeniable curve of her pregnancy. And this must be the sudden, mysterious Duchess. The entire House of Lords is buzzing with the news. A private ceremony, no announcements, no dowry. Arthur stood up slowly. The heavy ledgers hit the small table with a sharp snap. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "State your business, Harrington, and leave." Harrington ignored the warning, stepping closer to the piano. Isla shrank back instinctively, clutching the fabric of her skirt. She recognized the look in his eyes. It was the exact same predatory mockery she had endured from Mrs. Higgins. "I merely came to offer my congratulations," Harrington continued, his voice dripping with venomous politeness. "Though society finds it terribly curious. A woman of no known lineage, completely mute, carrying a child that arrived remarkably fast. Tell me, Your Grace, does the mute creature understand proper English, or did you simply purchase her from a street corner to hide a bastard?" The silence that followed was deafening. Isla closed her eyes, the familiar sting of humiliation burning in her chest. She waited for Arthur to dismiss the man, to perhaps ask him to leave quietly to avoid a public scene. She was accustomed to powerful men protecting their own dignity at the expense of those beneath them. Instead, Arthur crossed the room in 3 long strides. He did not raise his voice. He did not strike the man. He simply stopped inches from Harrington, radiating a lethal, terrifying stillness that made the older aristocrat take an involuntary step backward. "You have made a grave miscalculation, Harrington," Arthur stated. His voice was a perfectly calm, icy blade. "You believed my silence over the shipping tariffs was a sign of weakness. It was not. I own the debt on your family's northern estates. As of this morning, I have called it in. You are bankrupt." Harrington's cruel smirk vanished entirely, replaced by a pale, sickening horror. "You cannot be serious. The House of Lords belongs to me," Arthur interrupted smoothly, his dark eyes entirely devoid of mercy. "And this woman is the Duchess of Blackwood. If you, or anyone in your miserable circle of sycophants, ever speaks her name without the utmost reverence, bankruptcy will be the gentlest punishment I inflict." Arthur gestured toward the open doors. "Thomas, remove this man from my property. If he ever steps foot in my courtyard again, release the hounds." Harrington opened his mouth to argue, but the sheer, murderous intent in the Duke's eyes silenced him. The ruined aristocrat turned and practically fled the drawing room, his frantic footsteps echoing down the marble corridor. The heavy doors closed, leaving the drawing room in absolute silence once again. Arthur remained standing near the piano, his chest heaving slightly as he reined in the violent fury that Harrington had provoked. He slowly turned his gaze toward Isla, fully expecting her to be terrified of the ruthless, destructive power he had just unleashed. He knew exactly what he was, a beast dressed in fine, tailored wool, capable of ruining lives with a single signature. But Isla was not trembling. She was staring at him with wide, luminous eyes. She had spent her entire life being invisible, a convenient target for the cruelty of those above her. Whenever she was wronged, she was expected to lower her head and quietly accept it. No one had ever defended her. No one had ever stood between her and the venom of the world and burned it to the ground on her behalf. Isla stood up from the piano bench. She took a slow, deliberate step toward him. Arthur held his breath, his hands curling into loose fists at his sides, terrified of frightening her away. She stopped right in front of him. Hesitantly, she reached out, her delicate fingers lightly brushing against the fine wool of his coat sleeve before sliding down to find his hand. She laced her fingers through his, gripping his large hand with a surprising, fierce strength. It was a simple, silent gesture, but it carried the weight of 1,000 spoken words. It was an anchoring touch. It was gratitude. It was trust. Arthur looked down at their joined hands, the last remnants of his anger dissolving into a profound, overwhelming ache in his chest. He slowly closed his fingers around hers, securing her grip. In that quiet, sunlit room, he finally realized that he was no longer fighting merely to protect his heir. He was fighting for her. The fragile peace that had begun to blossom within the walls of the Blackwood townhouse lasted exactly 3 weeks. It ended abruptly on a night when the London sky tore itself open. It started as a low, ominous rumble over the dark waters of the Thames, but by midnight, a violent spring tempest had engulfed the city. The wind howled furiously through the narrow streets, throwing heavy sheets of freezing rain against the tall glass windows of the master suite. To anyone else, it was merely a harsh spring storm. But to Isla, lying awake in the massive 4-poster bed, the shrieking wind was a terrifying, living ghost. A violent crack of thunder shook the floorboards. In the sudden, blinding flash of white lightning, the grand bedroom vanished from her mind. Isla was no longer safe in a silk-draped bed. She was back in the unforgiving December blizzard. She could feel the biting ice slicing her cheeks. She could hear the heavy wooden doors of the country estate slamming shut, locking her out in the dark. She could hear Mrs. Higgins' cruel, venomous voice echoing over the roaring wind, condemning her to die in the snow. Isla shot up in bed, gasping for air that felt suddenly frozen in her lungs. Blind, overwhelming panic consumed her entirely. She scrambled backward, her hands tangling in the heavy blankets as she threw herself off the mattress. Her bare feet hit the cold floor, and she backed into the darkest corner of the room, pressing herself tightly between a heavy mahogany wardrobe and the patterned wall. She pulled her knees to her chest, burying her face in her arms as her whole body shook with uncontrollable tremors. She desperately needed to scream for help, to call out for someone to save her from the encroaching cold. But her throat was locked tight. She was trapped in a suffocating cage of silent terror. Arthur awoke instantly at the sudden shift in the mattress. The lightning flashed again, illuminating the empty space beside him. Panic, sharp and unfamiliar, flared in his chest. "Isla?" He scanned the dark room, his heart hammering against his ribs, before he finally found her huddled in the shadows. He threw off the covers and crossed the room in an instant, dropping to his knees on the hard floor without a single thought for his aristocratic dignity. "Isla, look at me," Arthur urged gently. He kept his hands visible as he crouched before her, intentionally making himself as unthreatening as possible. "You are in London. You are in my house. The storm cannot reach you here." Another deafening crack of thunder rattled the windows. Isla flinched violently, letting out a ragged, soundless sob. She squeezed her eyes shut, drowning in the traumatic memory, entirely lost to the fear. Arthur did not hesitate any longer. Ignoring the risk of frightening her further, he closed the distance and gathered her small, trembling body firmly into his arms. He pulled her against his broad chest, wrapping her in his overwhelming warmth, carefully tucking her head beneath his chin. "I have you," he murmured fiercely against her dark hair. His large hand rubbed slow, grounding circles on her back. "I am right here. No one will ever cast you out again. I swear it on my life. I have you." He held her there on the floor for a long time, rocking her gently as the storm raged outside. He absorbed her silent sobs, offering his own steady heartbeat as a tether to pull her back to the present. He did not ask her to be brave. He simply offered his strength until hers could return. Slowly, the violent tremors began to subside. Her frantic breathing evened out, and the rigid tension in her muscles melted against the solid comfort of his chest. When she finally lifted her head, her eyes were red and exhausted, but the blind panic had faded. It was replaced by a profound, heartbreaking vulnerability. She looked at the man holding her on the floor. He was a powerful duke of the realm, yet he was looking at her with such raw, unguarded desperation that it stole the remaining breath from her lungs. Arthur reached out, his thumb gently wiping a lingering tear from her pale cheek. "Tell me," he pleaded, his voice thick with unmasked emotion. "Tell me what happened that night. Let me carry this burden for you." Isla held his gaze for a long moment. The wall of terror that had kept her silent for months was finally beginning to crumble under the weight of his undeniable devotion. She could not speak the words, but she desperately needed him to know the truth. She needed him to know why she had disappeared. She pulled back slightly, pointing toward the heavy oak desk near the window, and then mimed writing on her palm. Arthur understood immediately. He stood, offering her his hand, and gently guided her to the leather chair at the desk. He quickly produced a piece of heavy parchment and a piece of charcoal, setting them carefully before her. He stepped back, giving her the physical space she needed, though his dark eyes never left her face. Isla's hand shook as she picked up the charcoal. The memory burned in her mind, toxic and cruel, but as she pressed the tip to the paper, a wave of immense, unexpected relief washed over her. She wrote frantically, the dark letters scratching against the silence of the room. She poured the agony of the betrayal onto the parchment, reclaiming her narrative one silent word at a time. When she finished, she set the charcoal down and pushed the parchment toward him. Her heart hammered in her throat. She looked down at her hands, terrified that the ugly truth would somehow shatter the fragile sanctuary they had built. Arthur stepped forward and picked up the paper. The firelight flickered across his harsh features as he read the messy, desperate words. "Mrs. Higgins found us. She dragged me from my bed into the blizzard. She said you ordered it. She said you had no use for a maid now that you were finished with her. She said if I returned, you would have me hanged." The charcoal smudged beneath Arthur's thumb as his grip tightened on the parchment. A terrifying, lethal silence fell over the room. The air grew impossibly heavy as the full scope of the betrayal slammed into his chest. The woman he had secretly loved had been thrown into the freezing night, pregnant and terrified, believing he was the monster who had condemned her to die. The paper crumpled in his fist. Arthur dropped it to the desk and closed his eyes, a ragged, tortured breath escaping his lips. When he opened his eyes again, the calculating, untouchable Duke of Blackwood was entirely gone. In his place was a man completely broken by the pain his household had inflicted upon her. He moved around the desk and dropped to one knee before her chair. He took both of her trembling hands in his, pressing them fiercely against his lips. "Look at me," Arthur begged, his voice cracking with a desperate, overwhelming sorrow. Isla lifted her gaze, fresh tears blurring her vision at the sight of the most powerful man in England, kneeling before her in absolute emotional surrender. "I never ordered it," Arthur swore, his dark eyes blazing with an agonizing truth. "I swear to you on my soul, Isla. When I left for the north, I intended to return and move you into the main house. I intended to protect you. When I came back and found your room empty, Mrs. Higgins told me you had stolen money and run away in the night. I tore the estate apart looking for you. I rode through the surrounding villages for days." He reached up, gently framing her face with his large, warm hands. His thumbs traced her cheekbones, his touch carrying a reverence that felt like a quiet prayer. "I never stopped looking for you," he confessed, the heavy, protective walls around his heart finally collapsing into ruin. "I have never stopped wanting you, not just for the heir, for you, only you." The remaining ice in Isla's heart shattered completely. The agonizing fear that she was merely a vessel, a temporary obligation to be hidden away, evaporated in the intense heat of his confession. She saw the unguarded love in his eyes, fierce and possessive, yet incredibly tender. He had not discarded her. He had grieved for her. With a soft, muffled sob, Isla leaned forward and pressed her lips against his. Arthur groaned, a deep, guttural sound of pure relief, and caught her in his arms. He stood, pulling her up with him, refusing to break the kiss. His mouth moved over hers with a desperate, starving intensity, pouring months of terror, longing, and suppressed love into the embrace. Isla answered him with equal fervor, her hands buried into his thick, dark hair, pulling him closer until the space between them ceased to exist. He lifted her easily, carrying her away from the desk and laying her gently against the silk sheets of the massive bed. The storm continued to rage outside the tall windows, but inside the chamber, the world had narrowed down to just the two of them. Arthur stood beside the bed, his dark eyes sweeping over her, illuminated by the soft firelight. He reached out, his fingers trembling slightly as he unlaced the ribbons of her nightdress. He did not rush. Every touch, every lingering kiss against her collarbone was a deliberate vow of worship. He treated her not as a broken maid, but as the only woman who held the power to destroy or save him. When he finally settled over her, taking his own weight on his arms to protect her and their unborn child, Isla looked up at him. She reached out, her fingertips tracing the harsh line of his jaw. She did not need a voice to tell him what she felt. Her eyes, luminous and entirely devoid of fear, communicated a profound, unconditional surrender. Arthur intertwined his fingers with hers, pinning their hands gently to the mattress. He held her gaze as he claimed her, his movements slow, deliberate, and anchored in a love so deep it terrified him. For the first time in his rigid, solitary life, the Duke of Blackwood allowed himself to be completely known. And for the first time since she lost her voice, Isla finally felt truly, deeply understood. As the tempest outside eventually faded into a quiet morning rain, a new, daunting question settled into the quiet corners of the room. They had secured their private sanctuary, but they still had to face the ruthless, watching world that waited just beyond their door. The morning sun poured through the tall, arched windows of the master suite, casting a warm, golden glow across the tangled silk sheets. Arthur stood by the edge of the bed, already dressed in a dark riding coat and polished leather boots. He looked down at his sleeping wife. His heart, once a cold and heavily guarded fortress, now beat with a fierce, protective warmth that still entirely amazed him. He reached out, his knuckles gently brushing a stray lock of dark hair away from Isla's peaceful face. She stirred, opening her luminous eyes to find him watching her. A soft, sleepy smile touched her lips, and she leaned into his hand, relishing the gentle contact. "I must leave for the northern estate," Arthur said softly. His voice carried a reluctance he had never felt before, a heavy resistance to stepping away from the sanctuary they had finally built. "Mrs. Higgins must be dealt with, and the staff must be replaced entirely before I bring you home. I will tolerate no whispers and no lingering shadows in the house where our child will be raised." Isla's smile faltered slightly. The memory of the cruel housekeeper still held a sharp, bitter sting, but knowing Arthur was riding out personally to defend her honor filled her with a profound sense of security. She sat up, pulling the sheets around her, and reached for his hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. She wanted him to know she was strong enough to wait for him. Arthur leaned down, pressing a firm, lingering kiss against her forehead. "I will be gone no longer than 3 days. Thomas has strict orders that no one is to disturb you. Rest, my love. I will return before you even realize I am gone." He left the chamber with long, determined strides, the heavy doors closing securely behind him. Isla listened to the fading sound of his boots on the marble corridor, wrapping her arms protectively around her stomach. For the first time in her life, she felt entirely safe. But the brutal world of the aristocracy did not respect locked doors. On the second morning of Arthur's absence, the quiet peace of the townhouse shattered. Isla was sitting in the drawing room, attempting to read a novel in the sunlight, when the heavy double doors opened. It was not a maid bringing tea, it was Thomas. The usually composed valet looked remarkably pale. His hands were gripping a crumpled morning newspaper so tightly that his knuckles were stark white. He stepped into the room, quickly closing the doors behind him, his eyes filled with a desperate, heavy sorrow. "Your Grace," Thomas began, his voice trembling slightly, entirely devoid of its usual formal distance. "I attempted to intercept this before it reached the staff, but it is already moving through London like wildfire." Isla set her book aside, a cold dread instantly pooling in her stomach. She stood up, holding her hand out for the paper. Thomas hesitated, visibly torn between his duty to protect her and the harsh reality that she needed to know the truth. Slowly, he handed over the broadsheet. The bold, black ink of the headline practically screamed from the page. "The fraudulent Duchess, Blackwood's heir or slum bastard." Isla's breath vanished. Her eyes scanned the cruel, venomous words printed beneath. Lord Harrington had made good on his threat of revenge. The article painted a horrifying, calculated picture of Arthur, claiming the great Duke of Blackwood had been driven mad by grief or manipulated by a scheming, voiceless vagrant. It detailed how he had pulled a pregnant beggar from the gutters of London, attempting to pass off a street urchin's child as a noble heir to secure his political power. The paper demanded an immediate investigation by the House of Lords, warning that Blackwood's reckless actions threatened the integrity of the entire British aristocracy. The paper slipped from her trembling fingers, hitting the Persian rug with a soft thud. Isla stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a soundless sob. The room began to spin. She could hear the faint, frantic whispering of the maids in the corridor outside. The scandal was not just a passing rumor, it was a declared, orchestrated war against the Blackwood name. She realized with terrifying clarity what this truly meant. Arthur possessed vast wealth, but his true power rested in his reputation and his standing among the peers of the realm. Harrington was successfully orchestrating his total ruin. If Arthur remained married to her, he would be mocked, ostracized, and stripped of his political influence. The noble legacy he had fought so ruthlessly to protect from the shadow of his abusive father would be burned to ashes. He would lose everything he had spent his life building, all because he had chosen to love a broken maid. He had saved her life. Now, her mere presence in his home was destroying his. "Your Grace, please," Thomas pleaded, taking a step forward. "His Grace will handle this upon his return. Lord Harrington is a desperate, ruined man. The Duke will crush him for this insolence." Isla looked at the kind valet, her eyes swimming with heavy tears. She knew Arthur would fight for her. He would tear London apart to defend her name. But the damage would be permanent. The child she carried would grow up surrounded by whispers and scorn, a constant, heavy burden on the man who had finally learned how to love. She could not let Arthur lose his world. She loved him far too much to be his ruin. With a sudden, heartbreaking resolve, Isla wiped her tears. She gave Thomas a small, reassuring nod, pretending she understood and accepted his comfort. She bent down, retrieved the newspaper, and walked calmly past him, toward the master suite. But the moment the heavy bedroom door closed behind her, the calm facade shattered completely. Isla moved frantically. She did not open the massive mahogany wardrobes holding the beautiful silk gowns Arthur had bought for her. She wanted nothing of his wealth. Instead, she reached under the bed, pulling out the worn leather satchel she had arrived with. She packed only her old, threadbare woolen shawl and a single plain cotton dress. She paused in front of the grand mirror. The heavy gold wedding band felt like a physical weight on her finger, burning against her skin. She slowly slid it off, setting it gently on the polished wood of the vanity. It belonged to a duchess, and she was stepping back into the shadows to become a ghost. Before leaving the suite, Isla walked down the corridor to Arthur's private study. The room smelled intensely of his sandalwood cologne and the worn leather of his ledgers. Her heart ached with a physical, tearing pain as she approached his massive oak desk. She reached beneath the collar of her plain dress and pulled out a thin, tarnished silver chain. Hanging from it was a heavy gold signet ring bearing the unmistakable Blackwood crest. She had accidentally kept it on the night of their singular, forbidden encounter months ago. It had been her only comfort in the freezing slums, a physical reminder of the man she had loved in secret long before he came to rescue her. With trembling fingers, Isla unclasped the chain. She laid the signet ring directly in the center of his desk, placing it over a blank sheet of parchment so he could not miss it. It was the only proof she could offer that the child had always been his. It was her final, silent confession of love. If she disappeared completely, Arthur could claim he had been deceived, annul the hasty marriage, and save his dukedom from Harrington's political fire. She turned and walked out of the study, her tears falling freely now. Isla avoided the grand staircase, slipping quietly down the narrow servant corridors that she knew so well from her past life. She reached the heavy iron door of the kitchen courtyard, pushing it open to reveal the thick, grey fog rolling through the damp London streets. "You cannot do this," Isla gasped, spinning around. Thomas stood in the shadows of the corridor, holding a silver tray, his expression shattered. He had noticed her plain dress and the worn satchel. He understood instantly what she was doing. "He will not survive it, Your Grace," the valet said. His voice broke with genuine emotion, stepping entirely out of his role as a servant to speak as a desperate friend. He spent months walking these halls like a dead man when he thought he had lost you the first time. If you leave now, the scandal will not matter, because there will be nothing left of him to save. Isla's chest heaved. She dropped her satchel and stepped toward the older man, shaking her head frantically. She pointed to herself, then pointed toward the streets, making a sweeping gesture of ruin. She placed her hands over her heart and then pushed them outward, trying desperately to explain that she was leaving out of pure love. She had to protect him from the fire she had inadvertently started. Thomas closed his eyes, a single tear escaping his dignified composure. He was a servant. He could not physically restrain the Duchess, no matter how much he wished to protect his master's heart. "He does not care about the title," Thomas whispered, looking at her with a profound, pleading sadness. "He only cares about you." Isla gave a broken, soundless sob. She stepped forward, gently taking the valet's hand and pressing it in a silent, agonizing gesture of gratitude for all his kindness. Then, before her resolve could shatter entirely, she picked up her satchel. Without looking back, she stepped out into the damp, freezing fog of the city. The heavy iron door clicked shut behind her, sealing her away from the warmth, the safety, and the only man she would ever love. The Duchess of Blackwood vanished into the brutal reality of the London slums, leaving behind nothing but a stolen signet ring and a broken promise. The massive mahogany doors of the Blackwood townhouse were thrown open long before the startled footman could even reach the handles. Arthur strode into the grand foyer, his dark riding coat caked with the thick, freezing mud of a reckless, unforgiving journey from the north. He had ridden his horse near to absolute exhaustion, driven forward by a violent, unexplainable instinct that something had gone terribly wrong in his absence. The house was entirely too quiet. The heavy, stifling silence felt completely wrong. "Isla!" Arthur's deep voice boomed through the marble hall, expecting the soft, familiar rustle of her skirts or the tentative opening of a drawing-room door. Instead, Thomas appeared at the top of the grand staircase. The valet looked older than Arthur had ever seen him, his shoulders bowed beneath a crushing, unbearable weight. He did not speak. He simply descended the stairs in slow, measured steps and extended a trembling hand, offering the Duke a crumpled, ink-stained broadsheet. Arthur snatched the newspaper from the valet's grip. His dark eyes scanned the scandalous headline, the vicious accusations penned by Lord Harrington, and the brutal public dissection of his sudden secret marriage. The political threat did not make him flinch. The danger to his dukedom meant absolutely nothing to him, but the sudden, agonizing realization of what this venomous paper would have done to Isla stopped his heart completely. He dropped the broadsheet to the cold marble floor and took the stairs 2 at a time, sprinting toward the master suite. He threw the heavy bedroom doors open, his chest heaving as he searched the room. The space was pristine, the bed was perfectly made. The heavy silk gowns he had bought her hung untouched in the open wardrobe, but her worn leather satchel was missing from beneath the bed. "No," Arthur whispered, a suffocating, icy terror gripping his throat. He backed out of the room, his mind racing wildly, and turned down the corridor toward his private study. The heavy doors stood slightly ajar. Arthur stepped inside, his eyes immediately drawn to the absolute center of his massive oak desk. Resting perfectly in the dark wood was a heavy gold signet ring attached to a cheap, tarnished silver chain. Arthur's breath left him in a sudden, violent rush. He stumbled forward, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he picked up the ring. He ran his calloused thumb over the familiar Blackwood crest. It was his secondary signet, the one he had thought he lost months ago on the night of their singular, fateful encounter. The devastating truth hit him with the force of a physical blow. She had not forgotten him. She had not viewed their night as a mere mistake or an abuse of power. She had kept his ring hidden against her heart through the freezing winter, through the starvation of the slums, and through the absolute terror of her silence. She had loved him long before he had ever realized he possessed a heart to give in return. And she had left it behind to save him. She had walked back into the freezing fog, sacrificing her safety and the safety of their unborn child, simply to protect a political legacy he did not even care about. Arthur clenched his fist tightly around the heavy gold ring, pressing it fiercely against his chest. The cold, calculating Duke of Blackwood died in that exact moment, replaced entirely by a man burning with a singular, desperate purpose. "Saddle my horse!" Arthur roared, tearing out of the study and flying past a stunned Thomas in the corridor. "Send the carriage to the East End, now." The labyrinth of the London slums was a suffocating nightmare of narrow alleys, rotting wood, and thick, choking fog. Arthur did not care about the dangerous men lurking in the shadows or the filth ruining his polished boots. He tore through the streets, kicking open the doors of crowded taverns, ignoring the shocked gasps of the destitute crowds as the towering, furious aristocrat tore their hidden world apart, looking for his wife. He finally reached the crumbling tenement building where Clara, the street seamstress, lived. He pushed the door open, his chest heaving, his dark hair plastered to his forehead by the freezing drizzle. The tiny, unheated room was lit by a single, dying candle. Isla sat on a broken wooden chair in the corner, wrapped tightly in her threadbare shawl. Clara stood protectively in front of her, holding a pair of heavy fabric shears as a makeshift weapon, but the seamstress lowered her hands the moment she saw the absolute devastation in the Duke's eyes. Isla stood up, her breath catching in her throat. She looked at Arthur, her wide, luminous eyes brimming with fresh, hot tears. She shook her head frantically, stepping backward until her shoulders hit the damp plaster wall. She pointed to the door, silently begging him to leave, to save himself from the absolute ruin she brought to his name. Arthur did not command her. He did not use his booming, authoritative voice. He walked slowly across the uneven floorboards, stopping a few feet away from her, and then, the most feared man in the House of Lords, a duke who commanded thousands and bowed to absolutely no one, slowly sank to his knees in the dirt and sawdust of the slum floor. Isla gasped, her hands flying to her mouth to hold back a sob. Clara slipped quietly out of the room, closing the heavy wooden door behind her, leaving them entirely alone. Arthur looked up at his wife, his dark eyes entirely stripped of pride, revealing a raw, bleeding vulnerability. He held out his hand, opening his palm to reveal the gold signet ring resting on the silver chain. "You kept it," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking with overwhelming emotion. "Through the cold, through the hunger, you kept me with you." Isla's shoulders shook with a violent, soundless sob. She clutched the rough wool of her shawl, unable to look away from the man kneeling in the dirt for her. "I do not care about the House of Lords, Isla," Arthur pleaded, the tears finally breaking free and tracking down his harsh, aristocratic face. "I do not care about the Blackwood name. They can take my wealth, they can take my titles, they can burn the estates to the ground. It means absolutely nothing without you. I am nothing without you." He reached out, his large, trembling hands gently grasping the hem of her worn skirt. He rested his forehead against her knees, entirely surrendering his heart to the woman who had always held it. "Please do not leave me," Arthur begged, his voice a broken, desperate prayer in the dim room. "I love you. Let them whisper, let them scheme. I will fight the entire world for you, but I cannot fight you. Please, Isla, come home." The psychological wall of terror that had locked Isla in silence for 7 agonizing months finally, completely shattered. It broke not from fear, but from the overwhelming, undeniable force of his love. He was not a master claiming his property. He was a man begging for the only piece of his soul that mattered. Isla dropped to her knees in the dirt, throwing her arms around his broad shoulders. She buried her face in his neck, feeling the heavy, ragged pulse of his heartbeat against her cheek. She pulled him fiercely against her, refusing to let the world take him away. She opened her mouth, her chest heaving as she pulled in a deep, shuddering breath. The muscles in her throat tightened painfully, fighting the trauma, but the absolute need to comfort the broken man in her arms overpowered the fear. "Arthur," she breathed. The sound was hoarse, incredibly fragile, and barely more than a whisper. Arthur froze entirely. He slowly pulled back, his dark eyes wide with shock and a sudden, blinding hope. He framed her face with his large hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears, hardly daring to breathe. Isla looked deep into his eyes, her own shining with a fierce, unbreakable love. She swallowed hard, pushing past the remaining pain, and found the strength to speak the words that would bind them together forever. "Take us home, Arthur." A ragged, beautiful sound of pure joy tore from Arthur's chest. He pulled her flush against him, capturing her lips in a kiss that tasted of tears, dirt, and absolute salvation. He kissed her with a desperate, starving reverence, pouring every ounce of his soul into the promise that she would never know a day of fear or silence again. When he finally lifted her into his arms, carrying her out of the crumbling tenement and toward the waiting carriage, the freezing London fog seemed to part before them. The Duke of Blackwood walked through the slums with his head held high, completely untouched by the scandal that awaited them. They were no longer a ruthless beast and a broken bird. They were 2 fiercely wounded souls who had finally found their way out of the dark, stepping out of the shadows and into the light, entirely, undeniably whole. Thank you for listening to this complete historical romance audiobook. If you enjoyed following Arthur and Isla's emotional journey from the freezing shadows to their triumphant reunion, please take a moment to like the video and leave a comment sharing your favorite scene. It truly helps the channel grow and allows us to bring you more immersive, full-length stories. Be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming Regency and Victorian romance audiobooks. The world of high society is full of secrets, and there is always another breathtaking love story waiting to be told. Until next time, thank you for letting us share this romance with you.